Yoo-hoo! What do you mean, yoo-hoo?
Welcome, one and all, to this, the very first episode of the Laurel and Hardy blogcast. I'm Patrick Vasey, the author of the Laurel and Hardy blog, and in this podcast series, I'm aiming to look at and discuss every film that Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy appeared in together. So that's covering a 30-year film partnership, starting with 1921's The Lucky Dog, and going right the way through to 1951's Atoll K. And rather than this just being an audio version of the blog, I decided to switch it up a bit, and I'll be chatting with a special guest on each episode, where we'll discuss the films and everything and anything Laurel and Hardy.
That's a good idea.
Now, as this is episode number 1, we'll be looking at film number 1. That is to say, the first appearance on screen together of Stan and Babe. And that film, as I've just mentioned, is 1921's The Lucky Dog. Now, this is not a Laurel and Hardy comedy as we know it. It was actually a Stan Laurel solo comedy with Babe Hardy appearing in a small supporting role. And so, who better to have on this first episode to talk about not only The Lucky Dog, but also Stan and Babe's solo careers than Rob Stone. Rob was the author of Laurel OR Hardy, the solo films of Stan Laurel and Oliver Babe Hardy, and he will be joining us later in the episode. Before we get into the episode proper, I'd just like to explain a little bit about the podcast. The initial idea was to make the blog more accessible, and so record an audio version, because I know that reading 1,500 words on a screen isn't always for everyone. So the first section of each episode will be just that, an audio version of the blog. In many cases, it'll be expanded and updated to the first blogs that were published online. But also, because we have the benefit of audio this time, I've also scattered in, or I aim to scatter in, a few special surprises inserted along the way. And that certainly is the case for this episode on The Lucky Dog. And following on from that, the second section will be an informal chat with my special guest, where we'll talk more about the film in question, and also about their own particular interest or association with the world of Laurel and Hardy. And I think that's about all you need to know. So, let's just jump into it, and we'll talk about The Lucky Dog. The Lucky Dog was filmed late January to early February 1921. It was a two-reeler produced by G.M. Anderson for Amalgamated Producing Company, directed by Jess Robbins. The main cast: Stan Laurel, Babe Hardy, Florence Gilbert, and Jack Lloyd. Before their initial encounter in 1921, jobbing actors Stanley Laurel and Oliver Babe Hardy both had a string of film credits to their names released by various movie studios. Babe, having featured in more than 230 shorts, sometimes as the lead, but more often cast as a supporting villain, or heavy, was a well-seasoned and respected professional in the movie business. At the same time, whilst only having just over a dozen films under his belt, Stan was headlining his own series of comedy shorts, trying to carve out a career as a leading movie star and follow in the footsteps of his ex-music hall colleague and roommate, who had become by this time the biggest movie star in the world, Charlie Chaplin. By 1918, following spells making films at Nestor, LKO, Hal Roach's Rollin Film Company, and also at Vitagraph, appearing alongside one of the hottest comedic stars in Hollywood, Larry Salmon, Stan's attempts to become a headlining movie star hadn't achieved the levels of success that he'd hoped, and ultimately, needing to earn a living, he returned to the arduous vaudeville circuit with his stage partner and common-law wife, May Dahlberg. 2 years later, Stan received another opportunity to restart his film career. The offer came from none other than Gilbert M. Bronco Billy Anderson. Anderson had recently started a new film company called Amalgamated Producing Company, and was keen to add a series of comedies to complement the westerns already in production, and Stan was identified as the comic that would carry the series. However, before the series could be made, there was the small matter of funding to be addressed, and so in order to encourage potential sponsors, Stan was signed up to film a pilot that Anderson could use to attract the necessary financial support for the proposed series of Stan Laurel comedies. The name of the pilot was The Lucky Dog. Until relatively recently, there's been much doubt as to the exact age of the film. But the uncertainty surrounding the date and location for the filming of this modest yet historic movie was finally put to rest when Bo Berglund, writing in the October 1996 edition of Italian magazine Griffithania, presented some very interesting and definitive research. Berglund's article mentioned the fleeting appearance, in the early scenes of the film, of a car license plate that proves that the picture had to have been made after January 1920. This discovery blew the original dates completely out of the water. Armed with this new information and taking into account Stan's vaudeville tour dates and Ollie's shooting schedules, it was deduced that filming of The Lucky Dog had to have taken place either late January or early February 1921. The same article also shed some light on where the film was made by piecing together letters painted on a fence in a number of shots from the scene with Stan in the tram. Although not all of the letters are visible at any one time, researchers were able to make enough out to piece together the words Los Angeles Ostrich Farm. To back this up, in an interview recorded in 1959, Stan himself recalled the film being made at the Selig studio, which would later become the studio of Louis B. Mayer, and which was close to Mission Road in Los Angeles, where the Ostrich Farm was located.
When I first made a picture for Bronco Billy Anderson, I'd never met him, and he called me up one night and asked me to come down to the hotel, that he would like to have me make a series of pictures. So at that time, we had no studio, so I rented space at the Celix Zoo studio here. Well, he had a director with him at that time called Jess Robbins, who is now directing over at Vitagraph Studio with Larry Seaman. So Anderson called him up and said, I got a new comic, I want you to make this pilot picture with him. So Robbins happened to be between pictures with Seaman. So he brought his cameraman over to direct this picture with me. And also brought Hardy, who Hardy was doing the heavies for Seaman. But Hardy, Babe as we call him later, didn't wear any mustache, he just played a heavy part. It was mostly for chase at those type of days. So that's the first time that I met Babe, but only for 2 or 3 days, and I didn't see him for probably 2 or 3 years after.
Whilst on the whole, The Lucky Dog is your average knockabout bit of silent slapstick, and certainly of its time, it has a prominent place in movie history, being the very first film Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy appeared in together. We meet Stanley Laurel, so broke he couldn't buy metal polish for a thumbtack, leaving his boarding house. His landlady, annoyed at not being paid, throws his bag at him, which falls to the floor, and just as Stan bends down to pick it up, she takes a swipe at him from behind with her broom. Stan bends too low though, and the lady is sent spinning around and around and around. She tries another swing, but the same thing happens, up to 7 times, until finally Stan remains upright long enough and turns to face her. At this moment, the tenant and broom finally and rather violently meet. The blow sends Stan hurtling backwards into the street, and as he sits upright on the tram lines, his injuries appear to have given him some sort of concussion, as he soon starts to see fairies, or angels, or something. Anyway, he sees some maidens dancing around him, and we too, as the audience, can see these transparent dancers, which is actually quite an impressive special effect for early 1920s comedy. In his daze, he imagines that one of the maidens is coming to kiss him, so he closes his eyes and puckers up. At this precise moment, a little stray dog runs up into his arms looking for affection. Stan eventually becomes sensible of the fact that he's not kissing a maiden, but has a stray mutt licking his face, and so we are now introduced to the Lucky Dog himself. It's during these early sequences that Stan has a couple of impressive and potentially back-breaking stunts, first involving bouncing off a stationary tram and landing straight onto his back, and then seconds later a moving motor car drives past and scoops him up in its grille. I think these pieces of action really demonstrate the knockabout skills that Stan must have learned as his bread and butter during his years as a British music hall and American vaudeville comedian with Fred Karno's troupe. Eventually, Stan collects his belongings, which have been scattered on the road, and stuffs them all into his bag, unaware that the little stray dog has also stowed himself away inside. And suddenly, to Stan's surprise, the bag starts running off down the street, thanks to some hidden puppy power, of course, and Stan gives chase. And so we come to the main action of interest, at least to our Laurel and Hardy fans, as we come to the very first on-screen meeting and bits of business between our two heroes. Stan chases his bag along the line of a fence, which turns a sharp left corner and continues off in a new direction. At the corner, he dives on top of the possessed bag, finally bringing it to a halt. Unbeknownst to Stan, around the corner, Babe Hardy, playing the part of a heavily mustachioed villain, is robbing some poor chap at gunpoint. Although they are completely unaware of each other, Babe and Stan end up standing back to back. Actually, they're bottom to bottom as Stan bends over to pull the dog from the bag. Babe then takes a huge wedge of folding money from his victim and stuffs it into his back pocket, or so he thinks. He's actually cramming it into Stan's back pocket. Liberated from his cash, Babe's victim is allowed to run free, and Babe turns on his heel and almost falls over Stan. And now it's Stan's turn to be held at gunpoint. And Babe growls the first ever line of dialogue between the two comedians. "Put 'em both up, insect, before I comb your hair with lead." There follows some nice business between the two, as Stan, holding the dog under one arm, makes life difficult for an honest robber. Eventually, Babe finds the bundle of cash in Stan's back pocket and begins to count it. This completely bamboozles Stan, who's never seen so much money before, let alone had it in his pockets. And he visibly tries to process all of this in his mind, in true Stan style, and he even double-checks with Babe that money came out of his pocket. In the end, Stan takes the money back off Babe to count it for himself. He then distracts Ollie and makes him look the other way, runs around behind him, kicks him in the seat of his pants, and runs off down the street with Babe in hot pursuit. The following chase sequence with the dog in tow is a good bit of fun, with Babe's gun jamming every time he gets a good chance to shoot Stan. But once he's given his assailant the slip, Stan wanders off and tries to ditch the dog in a dustbin. Until, that is, he realises he's been closely observed by a policeman. Stan makes his excuses and quickly departs, and round the next corner he takes a shine to a posh-looking lady who's about to enter her dog into a dog show. Keen to impress the lady, Stan uses his little stray dog to try to get into the show himself, but he's denied due to the fact that his dog is not a pedigree. Undeterred, and refusing to take no for an answer, Stan sneaks into the show anyway, and immediately he and his little mutt cause so much trouble that a lot of the dogs run riot, causing absolute chaos in the show, and ultimately they escape out into the streets and leg it. Stan's new lady friend's pedigree dog is one of those that escapes, and she is understandably upset. So Stan gives her his dog, at which she appears overjoyed. And I can't help thinking it's a little bit strange how casually the lady accepts losing her pedigree pooch, but only to be immediately overjoyed with the gift of Stan's mutt as a replacement. Anyway, Stan ends up driving home with the lady to meet her father, much to the annoyance of the lady's boyfriend. The annoyed boyfriend hires a hitman to come back with him to the house and plan a revenge that's worse than the telephone service, so the cards say. Of course, as you guessed it, the hitman is Babe Hardy. Back at the house, there are some nice scenes again with Stan and Babe interacting. In a quiet moment, Babe sits beside Stan on the sofa and tries to shoot him in the head. Stan sticks his fingers in his ears so as not to hear the loud gunshot, but Babe's gun again jams every time he tries to pull the trigger. In true Stan style, he tries to be helpful and assist Babe by repairing the gun for him. Finally, the plotting pair of Babe and the boyfriend throw a stick of dynamite under the sofa that Stan and now also the lady's father are sitting on, only for the lucky dog to come out running from underneath the sofa, dynamite in mouth, chasing the baddies away. In the end, the naughty ones are blown up in good cartoon fashion, and Stan, the lady and her father, and not forgetting the lucky dog, live happily ever after. So, although the film is far from a typical Laurel and Hardy comedy, there are teasing glimpses throughout of the magic that would eventually follow. The boys themselves are easily recognisable, but their characters couldn't be further from the Stan and Ollie that we have come to know and love. There was clearly some way to go before the potential of the team would be realised. Unfortunately, Bronco Billy Anderson's attempt at selling the lucky dog to financial backers drew a bit of a blank, and it took around 12 months and much persistence from Anderson until a contract was finally agreed with Metro Pictures Corporation for the production of a series of 8 Stan Laurel comedies. Despite this, after the cameras stopped rolling on the lucky dog, Mr. Laurel and Mr. Hardy parted ways, and their paths wouldn't cross on screen again for another 5 years. But for the first pre-teaming film, The Lucky Dog is watchable, it's reasonably enjoyable, but most of all, it is just about as historically and important a film as you can get.
You don't believe me?
Yes, I don't believe... What do you mean you don't believe me?
Today's special guest is someone that all fans of Laurel and Hardy owe a special debt of gratitude to. In the past, he's worked at USC Warner Brothers Archive, UCLA Film and TV Archive, and is currently a moving image curator at the Library of Congress. But not only that, and the main reason that he is so important to us on this podcast is that he's the groundbreaking author of Laurel OR Hardy, the solo films of Stan Laurel and Oliver Babe Hardy, and that person is Mr. Rob Stone. So, all the way from, somewhat appropriately, Virginia, Rob, welcome to the Laurel and Hardy podcast.
Well, thank you very much. Glad to be here.
That's our pleasure, absolutely our pleasure. And I've got to ask, are you anywhere near the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia?
We are. If you look out our window, you see the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, and I have to tell you, my wife has been the victim of me singing that song a number of times as we drive around.
Oh, I can imagine. I can well imagine. That's fantastic. So first guest on our first episode, thank you so much. I should probably apologize in advance for making you my guinea pig. This is the first time I've done this. So the first thing I wanted to do is ask you if you could tell us a little bit about your work at the Library of Congress. What is the Library of Congress and what do you do there?
Well, the Library of Congress is the United States National Library, and we collect just about everything. I happen to be in a division that used to be called Motion Picture Broadcasting and Recorded Sound Division, but now we're called the National Audiovisual Conservation Center. So, they love throwing around their, acronyms. NAVCC, they call us in some places. Anyhow, I actually work at the Packard Campus for Audiovisual Conservation, which is in Culpeper, Virginia. The main library is in Washington, D.C. But so our division, we collect anything that's moving image, anything that's recorded sound. We're the largest moving image archive in the United States. We're the largest recorded sound archive in the world. And so I take care of the moving image material. I always tell people when I see them on the street, I take care of old movies and you're paying for it with your tax dollars. So, that makes them feel good, I guess. I don't know. But so moving image, television, motion pictures, home movies, educational films, video games, anything with a moving image, we collect. So it's pretty interesting. We have 150 million feet of nitrate film and something like 3 million items in our safety vault. So it can keep you busy looking at stuff if you ever get a chance to look at it. Because when you work at an archive, the last thing you get to do is watch the stuff. You're usually busy. I acquire the stuff. I program it in our theater, send it up for preservation, work with video distributors to put it out on Blu-ray, and none of that includes watching it. But every once in a while, we get to watch something.
Does anybody get to come in? I mean, like a normal library would. Can people come in and watch things, or?
They can if they go up to one of our research centers, which are still in Washington, D.C. They can, they have to do it ahead of time, but they can book a research appointment and go and watch things. And we're trying to put more and more online and things like that. But that was my first exposure to the library. Was 25 years ago when I was researching the book Laurel OR Hardy. I was one of those guys that went up to what they used to call reading rooms. Now they're research centers, but I went to the reading room and sat down and watched all of this great old film that happened to have Babe Hardy in it or Stan Laurel in it.
Fantastic. So do they have a big catalog of Laurel and Hardy?
Well, here's the thing. It's a good and a bad in a way. At one point, we had the Hal Roach collection, which Hallmark then pulled about 25 years ago, pulled from the library. They held on to it for the longest time. And then right before I left UCLA, they were looking to get rid of the material. And so Dick Bann and I worked to get the stuff donated to UCLA. But so all that Hal Roach material, we had it all at one point. And we still have a lot of it because we only had to give back the nitrate. We didn't have to give back what we preserved. So we have a lot of that. And then, surprise, surprise, I'm not even sure how this happened. We happen to have a lot of Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy solo films that we've acquired over the last 10 years. Suspiciously, I wonder how that happened. But no, we we do have I've been working on a survey of our particularly nitrate holdings, and if you're a fan of Laurel and Hardy, we got stuff for you. But if you're a fan of Hal Roach in general, we got a lot of Charlie Chase. We've probably got more Snub Pollard films than anybody would ever want to watch. And then just in general, we have quite a wealth of silent and early sound short comedies. So it is kind of it is a paradise for people like me and you. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds fantastic. So we touched on Laurel and Hardy then. So I'm always interested to hear how people discover Laurel and Hardy in their lives. If you can remember, can you share with us your Laurel and Hardy backstory, how you found them?
Well, I think probably the first thing I ever remember seeing of Laurel and Hardy is I'm from Los Angeles originally. Well, not Orange County, which is right below Los Angeles, but all the Los Angeles television stations. They used to have the early show and the late show and the late show on one channel. And they showed all these, they showed the Hope and Crosby Road pictures. They showed W.C. Fields. They showed Abbott and Costello. And they showed the Fox Laurel and Hardy. So the bullfighters, Great Guns, Jitterbugs. Those were the first things I ever saw. And I thought, wow, these guys are really good. And I got involved. I went to the local library, was showing some films one afternoon. So I thought, well, I'll go watch them. And I can tell you what the films were: Barney Oldfield's Race for Life, The Adventure with Charlie Chaplin, and Perfect Day with Laurel and Hardy. Now, mind you, I liked the Fox Laurel and Hardys because, I'm sorry, a bad Laurel and Hardy movie is better than most any other movie in my opinion.
Agreed. Yeah, agreed.
But when I saw Perfect Day, it was like, the clouds parted and the sun shined down on me. I went, oh my goodness,
yeah,
those guys. And at that point, I was hooked because it was just, I couldn't believe how good, how really, I enjoyed the other movies, but the Perfect Day was kind of an epiphany, kind of, oh my God, I can't believe it. And so then from that, I, scrounged up and watched as much as I could, the Youngson compilations when comedy was king and the golden age of comedy. And then, so that's kind of where I got into Laurel and Hardy initially was that. And then I think what really did it for me is one day I was up at the drugstore, our local little drugstore, and they had a little display of paperback books. And there was a yellow paperback book with Laurel and Hardy from, I guess, Hooskow, that says Mr. Laurel and Mr. Hardy by John McCabe. And I read that book, and so now I was not only hooked with their movies, but I was hooked to them as like their life story. So, so that's kind of how it hit for me.
That's great. But that was exactly my first book as well, the John McCabe book. It's interesting you say that. I mean, certainly coming from the book that you've written is their very early stuff. You found them from their very later stuff. But also, I don't know if you listen to the Marx Brothers Council podcast, which is a really, really good podcast. A lot of people seem to have discovered the Marx Brothers through their later films, which obviously, again, people don't seem to think is their best work, to put it lightly. But yeah, that's really interesting. I've not come across a Laurel and Hardy fan, I don't think yet, that has discovered them through, the Fox films, which is brilliant. And to be hooked from those, I think, that's it's only uphill from there, isn't it? Really superb.
Yeah, I mean, once you start watching their entire, filmography, you realize the Fox films were a drop off. But since I already held them in such high regard, I just went up from there. So I kind of feel fortunate in that, now watching those older films, the later films, the Fox films, you cringe a little bit because you've seen Perfect Day or Toad in a Hole or, Men of War, whatever one. And they were so great that you then do kind of look at those later films a little bit differently. But I like them all.
It's the best way to do it. Now, if memory serves me, at the age of 14, didn't you set up a Sons of the Desert tent?
I did. I was 14, and there was a tent in Los Angeles, the Way Out West tent, which was, it's always been kind of one of the big tents because they always had the Hollywood stars come to them and stuff. But I was 14, and it was, I was literally 45 minutes from Hollywood. So, a 45-minute drive to go to a meeting and a 45-minute drive back was not anything that I could get a parent to do for me. So I wrote to John McCabe and I said, hey, I'd like to start a tent. And I don't know if he knew how old I was, but he consented to it. Our local newspaper used to have a series of articles called The Troubleshooter. So people would write in, hey, troubleshooter, how do I varnish a park bench? Or, hey, troubleshooter. And I'd say, hey, troubleshooter, I'm starting this club and I need to find other people that are interested. And that's how it happened. I got, 20, 30 some odd responses from that, found some place to meet, and we started meeting. So that was it.
And did Randy Skretvet take over as Grand Sheik? Am I right with that?
He did. I after about 3 years, I went off to college and Randy took over. And then, when Randy needed a break, Brent Walker, if you know who Brent Walker is, he wrote the Mack Sennett book and Bowery Boys book. Brent Walker took over, and I figured out one time that tent, I counted up all the books that had been written by people out of that tent. It was like 25 books because, Jordan Young went to that tent, Randy Skretvet, Brent Walker, a guy named Dave Koenig that does a lot of books on Disney, the Lindbergh brothers who did some animation books. For some reason, we just happened to be the book tent. But Randy was really the one that kind of, he took over after I did 3 years, and he kept it going for another 20 something after that. So it's really, I may have started that tent, but he was really the one that kind of made it happen. Yeah.
Fantastic. So why did you decide to write the book, Rob?
Well, fast forward many years later, I was in college at a later age. I had dropped out of college and was a printer for about 10 years, but I decided to go back to college. And this was right around the time that Randy's book came out. And I read the book and I just absolutely loved it. But there were only like 2 or 3 pages at the very beginning that said, yeah, they made a lot of movies and then they got together. And so I went and I got Mr. Laurel and Mr. Hardy and read that again. And then I got another book and then some. There used to be a couple of these books called Filmorama or something like that, were like filmographies. And so I just started reading more and more about that era, and none of these filmographies matched. Nothing made any sense. And so I just, curiosity got me more than anything else, because it just seemed odd that they made, and here's one of those arguments that can get started up. At that time, it was 105 films. Now people are arguing over, what film number something is. But at that point, it was 105 films. And then you look at these filmographies, as bad as they were from their solo years, and there's like 2 or 3 times that many films. And I thought, we got 300 or 400 more films with these guys in them. We ought to pay some attention to them. So that's kind of what caused me to do what I did.
Well, thank heavens that you did. I mean, it's a fantastic, and it's a great companion book to Randy's book. I mean, when I read Randy's book, and I agree, Randy's book was like, I loved it, absolutely loved it. And I just couldn't kind of fathom how you would go about researching a book of that nature. And when I look at your book, you're going back even further into the past. What were the kind of the challenges of researching a book about, films from over 100 years ago? Well,
I mean, the first thing was, there was no filmography, no true filmography. So the first few years, I really felt like it was more archaeology than anything else. Digging around, trying to figure out what films these guys were in. Where did they work? Films didn't always come out. It's not like if a film comes out in 1920 doesn't mean it was shot in 1920. Maybe it was made years ago and across the country. And so you had to kind of map out where these guys were. And so that was the biggest challenge initially, was just figuring out what just the skeleton of a filmography was. Titles, studios, how that went. Then after that, it was finding the resources. I lived in Los Angeles, but a lot of the resources were in Washington, D.C. or New York or whatever. I mean, nowadays with sites like Lantern, you can, sit in your bed in your pajamas on your laptop and accomplish the same thing that I had to do 25 years ago, flying to New York or Washington, D.C. and doing my research at a time when I had, children who were all preschool, and I worked as a teacher at that point, and teachers don't make a whole lot. So, I would fly back to the East Coast for a couple of weeks during the summer and stay at youth hostels. So I'd be sleeping in the same room with 7 guys and just cross my fingers that only half of them snored in order to do some of this research. Nowadays it's just so much easier to get done. But so there were logistical challenges, but to me the biggest thing was that having to create that filmography.
Yeah, especially with Babe Hardy. I mean, the amount of films that Babe Hardy was just incredible.
Well, I found one 6-8 months ago. I decided to look at every Lubin film that we have, and there was one called Magazine Cooking, and it's about this woman who's just newlywed, and she wants to cook for her husband. So she goes to the butcher to buy a goose, and the butcher ends up being Oliver Hardy, and he's in the film for maybe less than 10 seconds. Of course, you have to wonder how many of those appearances exist where, they hardly ever published the cast at all anyhow, much less someone who's just got a fleeting spot in the film.
So do you have plans to update the book?
I'm finishing up a book right now. I'm 98% done with it. And when I'm done with that book, I do plan on updating the book. I was going to do a 20, one of those kind of things. I'll do a 20th anniversary edition. Now I'll do a 25th anniversary edition. I do. There's a couple films I need to drop off the list because I've discovered that particularly most of this is Hardy. There's a couple films that Babe wasn't in, but I've discovered 2 or 3 that he was in. So I know more than I used to know. And then the other thing is more of these films have come to light, and certainly more stills and frame grabs and things like that. So the text of the book will be revised, updated a bit, but the real big thing will be the illustrations will be highly improved because there's just so much more available. And now that people, know that I'm the solo guy, they send me stuff. So, when I first started doing the book, that you talked about challenges with the book. Another one of those things was I didn't know that many people. Probably the biggest plus to all this was I went to the Sons of the Desert convention in New York City in '93 or '94, I forget when it was. And I was pretty far along on the book, and I walked in, I introduced myself to somebody, and said, "Oh, there's another guy here that's writing a book on the solo films." And my heart dropped because I'd already put 5 or 6 years into this thing. I was on the home stretch. And they introduced me to Dave Wyatt, who knows as much about the solo films as anybody. And we talked a little bit, and I handed him my book. I said, "Well, here, read it. Tell me because I was that far along." I said, "Read it. Let me know. I'll share my information if you share yours." And he came back to me the next day and said, "How can I help you? You're so farther along than I am." So from that point, I had a UK, but a European connection. And over the next couple of years, the amount of material that Dave sent to me from Europe, because I wasn't particularly well connected in America, much less Europe. So that was kind of a godsend that Mr. Wyatt and I hooked up, because it really made the book a lot better than it was shaping up to be.
And that seems to be the way within the Laurel and Hardy community that I've experienced so far, is that people are sharing with that kind of stuff. It's not kind of very selfish. It's very, very sharing. So yeah, good on Dave Wyatt. That's fantastic. In fact, I was at the Sons of the Desert convention for the Helpmates tent last November, and Dave Wyatt was showing a new clip that they'd found where Stan and Babe are sort of presenting to the camera. I think it was for like the foreign audiences or something.
Sure.
Never seen, nobody ever seen it. It was a fabulous thing to see, and it was just to have somebody there like Dave White. It's just incredible, and I think every year he's bringing something, wonderful for people to see.
Yeah, there are the film collectors and types that tend to want to be hoarders, and if they have it, it's theirs. But I've ran across so many more that are the opposite, that are just extremely helpful. I mean, Randy Skrebitz is top of the list. I asked him the other day. I said, because he's got this scrapbook of Oliver Hardy's, of his Vim days, and the book I'm finishing up has to do with Vim and some other things. And I said, hey, Randy, I need to take another look at that scrapbook. If you ever scan it, could you let me see it? Couldn't have been an hour later, I get a email, saying, download these files. And he sent me the entire scrapbook, high resolution scans, and said, of course you can use whatever you want,
Brilliant. I think from some of the things that I've put out on my Facebook page, I've noticed that quite a few Laurel and Hardy fans kind of shy away from the silent films. So from that, I'm guessing that probably quite a few people haven't visited the solo films at all. So could you, for the benefit of the listeners, can you recommend sort of 2 or 3 titles from the boys' solo work that are good examples that you can think, well, let's have a look at that, see if this does anything for me?
Well, they'll get to look for themselves within the next month or two. We got a new Blu-ray coming out from Lobster of solo films that I've worked on with Serge Bromberg. We kind of co-curated it, and I just turned in the film notes for that. So there'll be a bunch of those coming out. So with Stan, because it's one reel, it's kind of a remake of a film he did called The Pest, but Kill or Cure. It's kind of fast-paced. A lot of Stan's films from around that time seem to be, Stan as a gas station attendant, Stan as a traveling salesman, Stan as a, there wasn't tons and tons of plot, but those are all kind of fun because they're just series of gags thrown together. On the new Blu-ray that's coming out, we only have one of the 2 reels, but it really works. It's the second reel. We have When Nights Were Cold, which is a G.M. Anderson, and it's an absolutely, Stan in his solo days, the knock against him was he had trouble finding his comedy persona, that he kind of was not really comfortable in his own shoes. So when he did these parodies, like When Nights Were Cold or Mud and Sand, he really, when he was somebody else a little bit, he really shined because he didn't, I guess he didn't worry so much about it. He didn't worry. He went for the comedy than worrying about, how he looked or something. I don't know what the deal was, but so I always think it's funny because we would call these parodies or satires nowadays. Back in the day, they called them travesties. So there was actually an article that said Stan Laurel's new film is a travesty, which means something totally different now. But When Nights Were Cold is good. Mud and Sand's another good, of the travesties. Some of the things that people haven't been able to see before, but they will be now. Brothers Under the Chin, which has been lost and now it's found, and it's going to be on this new set. Stan's work with Larry Seaman, the 3 films he did for Larry Seaman, which he increasingly got more and more screen time. I find those interesting. I really, really wish that his earliest stuff would surface, Hickory Hiram, stuff like that. But yeah, I think that, a lot of those films in that kind of that second time that he came to Hal Roach in like 1923, when he's doing Kill or Cure and Collars and Cuffs and Oranges and Lemons and all those films have a bit of, something to, worth watching. For Babe, he's, his Lubin stuff, he's kind of a part of an ensemble. Every once in a while he gets a lead. The Vims are really good. where he's part of Plump and Runt, or even after that when he's doing his own thing for a while there. I like those films. I like the ones where he's a lead. He did a film called A Warm Reception, which was a Vim comedy that was after Plump and Runt, where he's the lead. That I like that. His work with Jimmy Aubrey, his work with Larry Seaman is fine. He just is not necessarily the lead. So they're fun, but he's kind of one of the guys. He is a very, very good supporting comedian, but the ones where he's the lead, there's an LKO that I saw in Prague, and I'm not sure it exists anywhere else, called Painless Love. He did a series of films for LKO in 1918. Most of them directed by a guy named Charles Parrott. So, Charlie Chase. So, and he's the lead in those. And if more of those could come to light, people would realize that, Hardy was a star comedian. He wasn't just a guy working in the background. He bounced back and forth from being a star or a supporting player. But, when he was supporting Larry Seaman, he was supporting the highest paid, including Chaplin, the highest paid comedian at the time. So it's not like he was, second banana in some grade Z film. He was second banana to the top guy. And then he did some work later on with Billy West that he'd done earlier work with Billy West. Some of those are good. And then some of his early Roach stuff, Say It With Babies, and some of the things he did with Chase at Roach, like Bromo and Juliet, Crazy Like a Fox. So there's plenty of solo stuff and the cool thing about the solo films is if you really watch them, you can start to see, Laurel and Hardy. Babe Hardy from almost the beginning did that look into the camera, like can you believe this? And and it's like, wait, that's Ollie, but it wasn't Ollie. So that's to me the thing about the solo films is if you want to watch a good comedy, they certainly are good comedies. But if you want to sit there and watch them and kind of be looking for the embryonic characters that they became, you can definitely see that too.
Yeah, and I think we're so lucky as well to have those films to be able to watch, because, I think you mentioned in your book, when you look at Abbott and Costello and the Marx Brothers, they're already there fully formed from the word go from the first film. But for Stan and Babe, you can see exactly, as you say, the genesis of those characters and how they develop film by film. It's really, we're very, very lucky, very, very lucky.
Sure, and the nice thing about Laurel and Hardy is we see that on the beginning, and then on the backside we see how most comedy teams seems to have been a stopping point and a breakup, and even the Marx Brothers, being brothers, didn't work together much later in life. And that's kind of the cool thing about Laurel and Hardy, is that they actually became closer later in life, not farther away. So if you want to look at a comedy team from kind of cradle to grave, they're kind of the prime example, because you can see Hardy from working in a movie theater in Georgia, and Stan with Carno, all the way up through them doing the tours in the 50s, and you can just see you get to see a progression of them as film comedians, but you also get to see a certain progression in their personalities and their relationships. So I think that's maybe one of the reasons why people are drawn to Laurel and Hardy, because they, in a lot of ways, kind of have there's a kind of a more full, rich aspect to them, where some of these other teams kind of came and went.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to just touch on we was just talking about Babe Hardy and the solo period as well. And it's sort of well known in Laurel and Hardy lore, if you like, how Stan was the main driving force behind the comedy and the creative aspect, and Babe would come in, do his day's work as an actor, and then disappear off to the golf course or whatever, which kind of left me with an impression that he was sort of disinterested in the filmmaking process, and maybe hadn't got that skill set. I don't know, but Just looking at some of the trade papers and things from the day, I read one just a few days ago where it says that Babe Hardy is now directing his own film company at Vim, and the Babe Hardy company. And you're just thinking, hang on, this isn't the image that I'd got of Babe Hardy. What's your take on that?
I think that there's an awful lot about Laurel and Hardy that people have decided is the truth. which I don't think the facts necessarily match up with. The thought that, Stan was the star and Babe was the guy who they kind of came in. He was by far the much more established film actor than Stan. And he did direct at Vim. But then he went from Vim right back into doing support work for Billy West at King B. But then when he went to work for Jimmy Aubrey, he co-wrote a few of those. And then this recently discovered Larry Seaman, Stop, Look, and Listen, the one reel that they found. Babe was the co-director on that film. So I think he always dabbled in it. I think sometimes if you watch some of his later solo films in particular, and even maybe some of the team films, you see gags and bits that happened earlier in Babe's career. So he may have been at the golf course a lot, but he obviously stepped into the occasional story meeting because there were gags and bits that he pulled in from his past work, because everyone's stealing from everybody. So he was stealing from a bit of his past. So yeah, I think Stan was more driven to that, but I certainly not sure that the inference that Stan was, greatly overskilled to Babe in that area. I don't believe it. I think some of it was preference. It certainly Babe was at the golf course a lot. I've read some articles recently where he was a really good golfer, like a scratch golfer. He could shoot par, and so. Yeah, I think maybe he had gotten to a point to where he didn't want to, work at it that hard, but that was a more of a personal preference than any professional, lack of ability.
I wondered if it was kind of sort of testament really to how little ego Babe Hardy had got, because from a political point of view, if you like, obviously Stan was very much, he wanted to be directing and stuff. So maybe he just thought, oh, God, happy just to stand aside and let you do it. If that's what you want to do, you crack on, sort of thing.
Well, I think that's true. I think if you look at their solo films, Stan was always kind of pressing. He was pressing. He wanted to be a kind of a movie star comedian. He really wanted to be top of the bill kind of guy. And Babe, he was just as comfortable being the guy in the lead or the guy on the side. And I do think that's probably speaks to their personalities more than any abilities they have, because when Babe would direct a film and star in it, such as trying to think which one. I always thought A Warm Reception was one he directed, but I recently found out it's not. But the films where he's a star of the film, he certainly can carry a film. But he's also one of those guys who can appear for 3 minutes in the middle of the film and make the film just by making a very supporting character kind of cameo appearance. So So I think maybe some of it was Babe was smart enough to know that if the drive Stan had versus his abilities, that if he'd have pushed too much, then you'd had two guys knocking heads, and we wouldn't have been talking about him after about 1934 or 5.
Absolutely. Now, this first episode is focused on the Lucky Dog, 1921. What can you tell us about that one, Rob?
Well, other than the Bo Berglund thing about checking the license plate, and so now we know it's 1921, not 1917. That was like, oh my goodness, why didn't anybody think of this before? It's a brilliant thing, but it was such a, now I when I look to try to identify a film, first thing I do is look at the license plates. It's like, why weren't we doing that before?
Yeah.
But then you get people that want to, they can't give it up and would say, well, but Lucky Dog was shot in 1917. They put 21 on the license plate. And I thought, Why would anybody do that?
Yeah.
But so what I know is, by 1921, Stan had taken a shot at being a film comedian, and not through his own fault, or maybe a little bit. He wasn't successful, and he did some films at Universal, either LKO or Nestor, and then he, filled in for Toto for 5 films at Roach, and they I guess didn't think enough of him to keep him around. And then he went and made 3 films with Larry Seaman. And this is another one of those stories that I don't believe. He wasn't fired by Larry Seaman. He wasn't tied to a tree because he was getting too much, screen time. There was the Spanish influenza that closed the studio. So Stan was a guy who needed to work to get fed, and he just went back into vaudeville. It wasn't that Larry Seaman was jealous of him. In fact, if you look at those films, he's barely in Huns and Hyphens. He's given a nice little vignette in Bears and Bad Men, and Prods and Frenzies is a team comedy. It's Larry Seaman, Stan Laurel as a team. And people say, well, Larry Seaman was jealous of him getting more screen time. Look at who wrote the films. It was Larry Seaman. So Larry Seaman, later on when he worked with Babe Hardy, he had no problem giving Babe Hardy screen time, or Frank Alexander, or some of the other folks that worked with him. But so Stan had a shot at being a film comedian, and it kind of just didn't work out. So he went back into vaudeville. Meanwhile, Babe Hardy, was very successful, both, again, as we've mentioned, a star and supporting comedian. And by 1918, he was in LA, and eventually went to work for Jimmy Aubrey. And Jimmy was not one of these guys that liked sharing, the credit. And the trade papers constantly said Jimmy Aubrey and Babe Hardy in their new film. And eventually Jimmy Aubrey had enough of that. So he basically fired almost his entire unit. He fired director Jess Robbins, Irving Reese, the cameraman, Oliver Hardy, and a couple of the other supporting players, because they were getting too much of the publicity. People argue whether they were even good films or not. But so early January 1921, he fires all these guys. Meanwhile, G.M. Anderson had hooked up with Stan Laurel, and they were looking to film a pilot film for what they hoped to be a series of comedies. And this was Stan's second and maybe last chance to get back into film. So, he was the one that was kind of pressing, I would think, here to make it work. And I found a few years ago, the library bought Stan Laurel's scrapbooks. They were sold 1 page at a time. We bought every page. I can't believe they were sold 1 page at a time. But so we have Stan Laurel's scrapbook. It actually is sitting in my office. And there's an article there, and God bless Stan. Most of the pictures, he cut everybody out except his head. And then most of the articles, he of course didn't put what paper it came out of. But there's this one article that says Vitagraph Pictures has loaned out Jess Robbins, Irving Reese, and Babe Hardy to G.M. Anderson for a film he's making with Stan Laurel. And I really want to find out where that's from, because I'm sure that is the very ever first reference to Laurel and Hardy in the same film. So basically, Lucky Dog is the Jimmy Aubrey Vitagraph unit that had just gotten fired, and they shot this film with G.M. Anderson. Jess Robbins had worked with G.M. Anderson at S&A, so they knew each other. So it's not like G.M. Anderson was just, walking down the street and there were these guys hanging out at Vitagraph who didn't have anything to do. So it was serendipitous that they were all free at the moment. And so that's how the film got made. And other than just G.M. Anderson basically taking this crew on, there was no predetermined, hey, let's get Babe Hardy to be in this film. It was just available players. So
yeah. And how do you think it compares to the other sort of solo, I suppose, Stan's solo comedies?
Well, I think Lucky Dog falls into, I know it eventually was released by Reelcraft, but it's really the GM Anderson's company was called Amalgamated. So there's kind of the Stan Laurel amalgamated comedies, which I really started with Lucky Dog, and then you get into Weekend Party, The Pest, When Nights Were Cold, Mud and Sand, Mixed Nuts in kind of a bizarre way. It's actually a pretty decent series. You can tell from that series that GM Anderson, they shot Lucky Dog, they shopped it around, they couldn't really find a buyer. But then they apparently went back into production to start shooting some more. And some of them start to look a little low budgety. The Pest is pretty good comedy, but then whatever they did to end up with Mixed Nuts was like outtakes from Pest and outtakes from other films. And so, but then once they got a contract with Metro, then things like When Nights Were Cold and Mud and Sand are actually very big budget films. So Lucky Dog in that, as part of that series, is one of the stronger entries. I mean, you do watch the film and kind of go, why didn't they get any takers initially? Because if you look at who else was making films at that time, Stan was certainly equal to or better than a lot of what was out there. The film's certainly not within his filmography. It's certainly not an embarrassment in any way. So, I think it's a good film. But you had people like Jess Robbins was a comedy director for decades, and Irving Reese was a very skilled cameraman, and GM Anderson, with his work through S&A and his own career as Bronco Billy, there were a lot of people who knew what they were doing, including people like Babe Hardy. So he had great support. Why the film didn't lead to more than what it did is a curiosity.
Is it a film that you've got in the Library of Congress?
I'm sure we have. We probably have a 16 millimeter copy of it somewhere, but we certainly don't have the more complete one that's come out. It was around for years and years and years in kind of a doopy 16, but in more recent years, apparently a 35 millimeter nitrate print has shown up, and so you get to see Stan and the dog in a little bit sharper focus than we are used to.
Right. I love that dog. The dog deserves some credit, I think, in that film, because he's great. So do you know anything about, is it on the new Blu-ray? I was going to ask, is that a film that's included in the solo films?
Which one? Lucky Dog?
Yeah. Is it in the new Blu-ray that you talked about?
Well, it's not a solo film. Oliver Hardy's in it. I actually had a kind of a difficulty trying to figure, I basically decided a solo film is a film that neither one of them are in. Because people would say, well, 45 Minutes from Hollywood is really a solo film, or Why Girls Love Sailors really a solo film. And I just, to me, it was like, okay, if they're both in it, I'm not dealing with it. Now I'll tell one. Nope, I'm not going to deal with it. So, yeah, Lucky Dog is not in the new Blu-ray, partially because it's already out. Most everything on the new Blu-ray, most everything is something that has not been seen before, or the few that have been seen before have not been seen at the quality that they are. Most everything that I sent off to Surge was from 35, new scans from 35 millimeter nitrate. So they're sharp as a tack, and these guys actually knew how to make movies back then, and they could keep the camera in focus. So,
can't wait. So, what's the sort of timeline, Rob? When can we expect to see that drop?
Well, I had to get my notes in, I think a week and a half ago. I tend to think it's going to be within the next month or two. I know all the scores have been recorded, all the transfers are done, all the cleanup's been done. There were 3 or 4 films that all we had were French titles, so I did my best Beanie Walker impersonation and wrote new English titles for those films because we couldn't find cutting continuities or anything else for them. So I think all the work's done. I think it's just a matter of, getting the packaging finalized and getting it out. I'm certainly hoping within the next month or two, but, current events may slow that down a bit.
Well, that's really exciting. I'm looking forward to that. That should be fantastic. which kind of brings me on to one of the last questions, really, Rob. Is there anything that you wanted to plug? Anything that you're working on? Obviously, we've got the Blu-ray and possibly an updated book in the offing. Anything else you wanted to plug?
Well, I guess I can plug it. It's 98% done. I really like looking into obscure things. The archaeology that I mentioned earlier, I really like doing archaeology. And I was sitting at home and was really looking at Babe's work at Vim. And I thought, well, what else was Vim doing? Because Babe Hardy will always refer to the year or two that he was with Vim as some of the happiest years he ever had making movies. So as I got looking into Vim a little bit more, it started to get more and more, well, okay, now there's the 35 pump and runs, but how many other films was Hardy in them? And so then I started, years later, I now have I've written a book on, I'm calling it Pokes and Jabs, because at Vim, there were actually two comedy teams, Plump and Run, but the big stars were Pokes and Jabs, Bobby Burns and Walter Stoll. So I got looking at Vim, and really there was a precursor to Vim called Wizard, and then there was a follow-up company called Jackson, and they're all Pokes and Jabs. So I've ended up writing this book called, and the title is another one of those long titles. It's Pokes and Jabs: The Before, During, and After the Vim Films Corporation.
Great.
So it's going to be real similar to the Laurel OR Hardy book, but it's kind of looking at one of these comedy companies that came and went like a 2 or 3 year period, and the silent era is filthy with these companies. The trade papers, Acme Productions, new, we're going to have 24 films of, a year. And then a year later, they're gone. No one knows where they are. No one knows what happened. And so I just thought maybe a case study is too highfalutin, but, a case study of one of these companies to just kind of show the flavor of kind of the Wild West aspect of film comedy back in those days. I mean, there was a guy who worked for Vim, a guy named Harry Naughton, and he married the owner of the company's niece, and she actually was a member of the board. She had stock in the company, but when they got married, he quit as the studio manager and went to work for a steamship company, because now that he was married, he needed to get a real job. So the aspect of these guys were making these movies, and then you see why somebody quit making movies. And why did they quit making movies? Well, because they made more money as a butcher down the street, or an awful lot of these guys would, make movies and then they'd quit and they'd go back into vaudeville because they made more money in vaudeville. So, that era of that a lot of us love is that, the silent film, silent short comedies was really during the era when it was not necessarily like, today, Hollywood and, the prestige of it was more kind of like, if anything, these guys might have been almost looked down upon more than propped up like movie stars are today. So that's it, that book. And then, I'm working with a couple other guys on a couple other book projects, but, they'll have to do their own promoting, because I don't want to, speak for them, but trying to keep up on that. Part of my work, part of my job at work is to keep these Blu-rays coming out through people like, Lobster. This is our first one with Lobster, but we put out a lot of stuff through Kino Lorber, Undercrank Productions, which is Ben Modell, and a few other folks. And I find real joy in that, because, the argument against the film archive is that, the film goes in and never comes out. Well, we're trying really hard to make sure it comes back out. So,
well, we've seen a lot of great, a lot of great releases just lately of films being preserved on Blu-rays. It's just wonderful to see. So I think we're very, very grateful for all that you guys are doing, and I think you're a very lucky dog yourself to be able to work in the Library of Congress. It sounds fantastic. And I think that just about wraps up all the questions that I've got. I've already taken up, I think, far too much of your time, Rob. So thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll speak to you again sometime.
I would look forward to it.
Wonderful. Thank you ever so much, Rob. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, bye-bye.
He is a great guy, ain't he?
He certainly is. You know I like him.
So that's about it for episode 1. There's just one last treat in store for you in a moment. But first, I just want to say a huge thanks to my special guest, Mr. Rob Stone. Rob, thank you so much. You were amazing. I'd also like to thank all of the other authors whose work I've enjoyed and used in the writing of my blogs over the last couple of years, particularly Randy Skretvet and Glenn Mitchell with Randy's The Laurel and Hardy, The Magic Behind the Movies, and Glenn Mitchell's Encyclopedia. Frankly, without those books, there probably wouldn't be a Laurel and Hardy blog. You can find affiliate links to all of those books and many, many more on the laurelandhardyblog.com, and there's a link to that website in the show notes. I'd also like to give a shout out to Pete Schroeder and all of the Bohunks Orchestra, whose fabulous music provides so much energy to this podcast. Again, if you'd like to buy CDs of their music, which I can't recommend enough, you can find links on the blog's website as well. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like it and share it as much as possible. And what would especially help me is if you could leave a review and maybe a 5-star rating on iTunes if you think it's worth it. But it really helps to get this podcast and Laurel and Hardy in general in front of more people. As always, I'd love your feedback, so please do let me know what you think or send me your questions or suggestions. You can message me on my social media pages, or you could send a very old-fashioned thing called an email. The address for that is laurelandhardyblog@gmail.com. That's Laurel and A-N-D hardyblog@gmail.com. And my final thanks, of course, go to you. Thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for listening. I do appreciate you, and I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you'd like to hear more episodes. I've got a great list of guests all lined up and waiting in the wings. So thanks again, stay in touch, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. And to end the show, I thought I'd leave you with this, as it seemed appropriate. And Rob, this one's for you and your good lady wife. So bye for now.
On a mountain in Virginia stands a lonesome pine. Just below is the cabin home of a little girl of mine. Her name is June, and very, very soon she'll belong to me. For I know she's waiting there for me 'neath that lone pine tree. In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, on the trail of the lonesome pine. In the pale moonshine, our hearts entwine, where she carved her name and I carved mine. Oh June, just like the mountains are blue, like the pine, I am lonesome for you. In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, on the trail of the lonesome pine.
In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, on the trail of the lonesome pine. In the pale moonshine, our hearts entwine, where she carved her name and I carved mine. Oh June, like the mountains I'm blue, like the pine, I am lonesome for you.
In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, on the trail of the lonesome